Fanfic Corner, presented by Jennifer. Comfort. Just a few hours ago, the Bad Batch had found Omega and reunited with her. Hunter had been tortured without her presence there. He felt hopeless not knowing where she was and what could have possibly happened to her. He felt like his whole world had been taken away, and nothing or no one could bring that feeling back without him having Omega back. Now that she was back in his vicinity once more, he felt relieved and reassured. Seeing her tear-filled eyes and feeling as her shaking body leaned into his touch destroyed him on the inside. Her tormented voice said it all as he asked her if she was okay. He could finally slow down and worry no longer, but he knew that all of this had taken a toll on both of them, mostly her. Hunter was on watch now. He listened as the quiet snores of his brothers filled the ship in the cold darkness. He looked out the window, staring off into the deep vortex of space, his thoughts dwelling on the events of the past few days. This takes his mind off his shoulder wound that jabbed at him annoyingly. He was pulled out of his thoughts as one of the lights flickered on the control board. He flipped a switch with a sigh. The light stopped flickering, but he did not remove his hand as he heard light footsteps disturb the rhythmic snores of the batch. Hunter waited to turn around until the light steps stopped a little after the doorway. "Can't sleep?" He gave Omega a soft smile. He followed her with his eyes as she slowly walked over to the chair next to him and pulled her knees up to her chest, hugging them closely. Omega's eyes gripped onto the stars, looking forward into the never-ending abyss of space. Hunter could almost hear her thoughts. They seemed so loud. He let the silence between them settle and fall to the ground. It might be picked up and formed into words, or it might just lie on the floor, resting into the calm darkness of the ship as it traveled on an endless course through space. But the silence retreated as it was gripped by Omega's desolate voice. "I keep thinking about the Kaminoans." A depressing shift in the mood occurred. "Seeing that place, I don't want to end up an experiment in a tube." Omega's tragic eyes bored into his heart. He felt a twinge in his chest, and his wound seemed to throb at her pain. That's not going to happen. Hunter looked intensely back into her eyes. His demeanor hardened in confidence. If I'm as valuable as you say, Lama Su will keep sending bounty hunters after me. She looked back into the cold darkness of the twinkling lights, blurred from the tears forming in her eyes. Hunter moved from his chair, the slight movement causing a grunt of pain to come from his lips. He crouched, spinning Omega in front of him. He looked up at her as she looked down at him. Hunter took her hand away gently from her knees, wrapping it in his warm palms. He can send everyone in the galaxy. Reassurance flowed from his voice as he moved a hand to wipe away a stray tear that had escaped her eye. You have us. Omega looked away from Hunter's gaze. You can't fight them all, she said, almost ashamed of her words. Omega, you don't have to worry. She closed her eyes, and he felt as she leaned into his touch slightly. You are never going back to Camino. He shook his head. She could hear the truth in his voice. This compelled her to open her eyes. Promise? I promise. Hunter stared back into her soul-gaping eyes and said with all his assurance. She practically leaps into Hunter, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. He's surprised by her sudden movement. His body tenses, and he lets out a small pained grunt as she hits his chest, accidentally colliding with his wound. He soon relaxes against her touch and throws his arms around Omega, holding her as tightly as she was. Hunter feels warm tears stain his blacks as they slowly trickle down Omega's strained face. He rubs her back soothingly. Hunter rests his chin on her back, holding her gently in his arms. You're safe now, Omega, Hunter whispers in her ear. He pulls back and looks into her weeping eyes. Hunter holds her face in his hand. They can't hurt you anymore. His voice was strong. She nods back at him, wiping the tears away. Hunter stands up with another grunt, her gaze attached to him. He reaches out a hand for her to grab. Let's get you back to bed. She slowly moves her hand into his. The energy of her heavy heart seemed to transfer to Hunter's body. He gave her a small smile as he rubs his chest. Hunter wondered what had happened to her, if what they did would have such a lasting effect on her for a while. He wanted nothing more for her than to rid her of this pain and trauma that left such a polarizing fear on the young clone that stood at his side now. They walked in silence back to the back of the ship. The only noise was from the sniffles every few steps coming from Omega and the soft snores of Tech. Hunter moved over towards Tech with his hands still in Omega's as she stayed behind him staring at the ground. He lightly shook the sleeping clone's shoulder. Hunter watched as Tech slowly opened his eyes. Tech nodded, understanding that it was his turn for watch. He slowly rose from the bunk, freeing it so that Hunter now had a place to sleep. Tech walked to the cockpit. Hunter let go of Omega's hand and bent down, reaching under his bed. Another sting of pain filled his chest. He opened his chest, pulling out a small container with pills in it. He took one in hopes that it would soon relieve his pain. Omega felt cold and lonely without Hunter's hand in hers, and she continued to stare at the ground. If she was left in her room alone again, she knew she would never go to sleep. Her thoughts would keep her up, running 1,000,000 miles per hour in her mind. stay with you?" Her sad voice choked out as Hunter stood up. He turned around to face eyes that seemed to penetrate his inner self. "If you want to." Hunter laid down on the bunk, hauling up the sheets as he waited for Omega. She crawled onto the bunk slowly. She looked so fragile. He placed the sheet on top of them and laid back, feeling the warmth of the blanket on his cold skin. The blanket may have been warm, but Omega still seemed to shiver as if a coldness forever flowed through her body, chilling her to the very core. She was balled up next to him, trying to keep all the warmth she could manage inside her curled-up body. Hunter moved a hand down to her blonde hair and rubbed her head gently. "Omega." He said her name, trying to imply that she could come closer to his body heat and warm her up. She looked up at him with her sad eyes once more. She slowly moved closer to him. Hunter wrapped his arms around her back, gently rubbing it up and down. Omega buried her face in his side, gripping his shirt in one hand and the other resting under her body. Hunter placed his free hand on top of hers, holding it there securely, making sure she wasn't going anywhere. He felt her relax against his body and let out a small sigh. She repositioned her body so she was taking up his body heat. She felt warm and cozy in Hunter's arms. She knew as long as she was with him, she would be safe. Hunter listened as her breath slowed and her body rose and fell less rapidly. She calmed down and now was drifting into a light sleep. The pain in his chest seemed to ease the more he fell under the serene noise of Omega's breathing. He looked down at her small body one last time before he closed his eyes and sighed. "You're safe now," he whispered quietly before finally falling into the depths and darkness of rest.